Okay, Stephen, I would like to ask you a few questions. First one is, in your opinion, why do you think environmental taxes have not been more popular in policymaking?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think the political climate in some countries has been very hostile to taxation in general. In the United States in particular, we had a president who made an explicit commitment to no new taxes. And I think in many other countries, the climate has moved very sharply against innovations in tax policy in recent years. But I think also there are some objective difficulties with carbon taxes and other environmental taxes that we would need to respond to very carefully if we were to make them palatable and acceptable, if we were to make it possible to introduce them without serious adverse effects. One of these is the effect on international competitiveness of industries that might have to pay more for their fuel or for other taxed inputs. A carbon tax, for example, would raise the costs of producing energy-intensive goods in Europe compared with energy-intensive goods in countries that didn't levy a similar tax. And we need to think about how we tackle that problem, or it would be a real political obstacle and a real obstacle for the firms concerned.
So you mean in order to make environmental taxes more popular, we have to take into account all these issues you mentioned. So to make them more attractive, we would need maybe some policy packages where we tackle different aspects, or?
Yes, I think with competitiveness, probably we need to think about things like exempting or having reduced rates of tax for the industries that would be most adversely affected. I think we need to be very selective about that. We can't give away far too much of the revenue. We can't reduce the scope of the tax to the point where it becomes pointless. But for the sectors that are most exposed to international competition, there would be an argument for reducing the rate of tax. I think the other big obstacle is probably one concerning the impact on the income distribution, and particularly the impact on poorer households, where taxes on energy in particular can be a particularly severe burden. And I think there we do need to think about how we use the revenue and how we package the additional tax together with measures that might compensate poorer households for the adverse impact, that might stimulate improvements in energy efficiency that would be a very important parallel to the tax, and I think that would also help to improve the responsiveness of households to higher energy prices. I think also we need to think about the politics of this. How confident are people that this revenue is not just going to be used to pay for wasteful expenditure? We need to convince people that there's a real reason for this tax, and that if it's going to be introduced, that is, that the revenues are going to be used for good purposes, whether that's for cutting other taxes or whether that's for specific environmental purposes. It's going to be a political judgment, but I think we need to pay very careful attention to the politics.
Thank you. With respect to market-based systems like we have it in the EU, the EU ETS system, the emission trading system, would you recommend some kind of floor prices like you have had in UK? Or what is your opinion on that things to repair this kind of mechanisms?
It's certainly the case that the EU ETS price has been very much lower than was expected, and I'm sure was very much lower than European policymakers had hoped. The recession in particular has meant that energy demand has been much lower than expected, and the price has been correspondingly lower for carbon. Whether that's then appropriately dealt with by setting a floor price, or whether that's better dealt with by withdrawing some of the allowances from the system, is, I think, a difficult call. One could systematically put in place a floor price or some kind of compensating tax that means that when the price of carbon in the EU ETS drops below a certain level, this is triggered to maintain a stable price for carbon. One reason you might want to do this is because you might be worried that if the carbon price is too volatile in the system, it undermines the incentives for long-term investment in carbon reducing, low carbon production. And so you might want to put that kind of thing in the system. But you could do that equally well by responding to periods when the price is low, by reducing the number of allowances you put into the system. I'm not sure that a floor price is better than that. Okay. It's really a question of political feasibility.
And what's the UK experience on that, on floor prices?
Well, the UK, yes, the UK introduced a floor price unilaterally, just as a matter of UK policy, for the electricity sector within the EU ETS. So for power generating companies in the UK, if the EU ETS price drops below a certain level, they pay an additional tax designed to bring the price up to the floor price that's been set. Frankly, that's just a mechanism for raising money for the UK exchequer, because what it doesn't do is provide or doesn't ensure any reduction in carbon emissions Europe-wide, because that's determined by the cap that the ETS sets. What it really does is ensure that at least some of the potentially lost revenue from auctioning is recouped through this compensating tax. It might have some longer-term benefits in terms of improving the stability of incentives, but I think a very large part of the consideration is the £2 billion worth of revenue that the government stands to gain from implementing this.
Okay, I see. Finally, what's your view on future policies, carbon taxes inside the EU and outside the EU? What is your perspective?
The big prize is systematic taxation of carbon. I think there are other areas where relatively modest progress could be made in environmental taxes. Some of those will be very important in the small areas where they're concerned. There are issues to do with particular commodities where taxes might be make a useful contribution, pesticides, fertilizers, and so on, perhaps. But I think the really big issue is getting the carbon price right. And I think for sectors that are outside the EU ETS, there's an important role to be played by carbon taxes in supplementing the role that the EU ETS plays within those industrial sectors that are covered by the ETS. In the longer term,
globally?
Globally, of course, I think one of the great attractions of taxes is that they demonstrate that you are doing something in a serious. Yeah. And I think an important part of international agreements on climate change is not just that countries sign up to some promises, but that they agree to do things that prove that they're actually taking action. And I think the countries that hopefully will sign up to promises in Paris will back those promises up with very visible action, because visible action will strengthen the confidence of other countries that have signed up that they've not been taken for a ride. So I think it will be very, very important for the agreement if countries that don't have systematic carbon pricing domestically, if they start to implement it. And I think carbon taxes are a very effective way of demonstrating that you're seriously trying to meet the commitments that you take on in a climate agreement.
Thank you very much for the interview, Stephen.
You're welcome.